She was only supposed to be the maid in the billionaire's mansion. Nothing more, nothing less. But one rainy night, the tabloids exploded. Billionaire Wycliffe and his black housekeeper. Too close for comfort. Suddenly, the whole city whispered her name, accusing her of crossing lines she never meant to. And just when the pressure threatened to crush them all, his daughter vanished into the storm, clutching a hand-painted sign that read only 2 words: "Please stay." What happens when survival is no longer about running, but about choosing to belong? Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this? And where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Amara Ellison had grown used to the quiet of her 1-bedroom apartment in Charleston. It was the kind of silence that didn't soothe, it pressed in, reminding her of the marriage she had escaped and the bruises no one could see anymore. At 25, she carried herself with the steady patience of someone who had already lived through storms most people never imagined. She wasn't looking for more drama. She was looking for a paycheck, a steady roof, and proof to herself that she could stand on her own. That was what brought her to the iron gates of Wycliffe Manor on a damp Carolina morning. The place stretched across acres, its drive lined with oaks that seemed older than time. The house itself wasn't just big, it was imposing, the kind of mansion you'd see in glossy magazines about wealth and legacy. Yet when Amara stepped through the heavy front door, the first thing she noticed wasn't grandeur. It was the cold. Not the temperature, but the absence of life. She had been told Silas Wycliffe wanted discretion, order, someone reliable to keep the house running. A man like him, widowed, successful in the medical technology world, and constantly in the press, didn't have time for anything messy. Amara understood rules, and she intended to follow them. Still, as she crossed the marble floor, she couldn't shake the feeling that this house was holding its breath. The first time she saw Elodie, the little girl was sitting at the end of a long hallway, half hidden behind a stack of books. 9 years old, pale dress, hair tucked neatly the way nannies used to do before they came and went. Her eyes were large, but not curious, watchful, as if she had already learned it was safer to observe than to reach out. Amara crouched a little, lowering her voice. "Hey there, I'm Amara. Looks like we're both new here." Elodie didn't answer. She hugged her knees tighter, gaze fixed somewhere past Amara's shoulder. The silence stung, but it wasn't unfamiliar. Amara remembered herself at 9, hiding in her grandmother's kitchen when her parents fought in the next room. That same helpless quiet. By late afternoon, Amara had been shown the kitchen, the linen rooms, the endless corridors. She moved carefully, almost reverently, as if her presence might disturb the balance of the place. While polishing the counter, her hand brushed against a picture frame laid face down on the shelf. She paused, turning it slightly, but didn't lift it. The glass edge was cool under her fingertips. When she looked up, Elodie was there, standing barefoot at the doorway. The child didn't speak, didn't move closer, just stared at the frame in Amara's hand, then at Amara herself. For a moment, neither of them said a word. But in the hush of that kitchen, with the smell of lemon polish still hanging in the air, Amara felt the start of something unspoken, fragile, but undeniable. At St. Aurelia Academy, the playground wasn't loud with shouting. It was loud with judgment. Kids didn't need to be cruel outright. They just needed to whisper loud enough for others to hear. Elodie Wycliffe walked through the school halls like she was underwater. She heard her name. She saw the sideways glances. But she didn't react. She just kept walking, small hands gripping the straps of her backpack like they were handles to something solid. Her teachers weren't unkind, but they were tired. One of them, Mr. Greenwald, told the counselor in passing, "She doesn't talk in class. Doesn't smile either. Smart kid, but closed off." Another chimed in, "She doesn't make eye contact. Refuses to partner up. It's like she's somewhere else." They weren't wrong. Elodie had been somewhere else for months now. Somewhere quiet, behind a wall she had built the day her mother stopped coming home. And no one, until recently, had tried to climb over it. At Wycliffe Manor, Silas sat in his office, fingers drumming against his desk. The school report lay open in front of him, and it wasn't scathing, not exactly. But it stung. Phrases like lax engagement and persistent emotional detachment didn't just critique a student. They pointed at a parent. He pushed the report aside and leaned back. His eyes drifted toward the doorway, half expecting to hear Elodie's soft steps or see her peeking in the way she used to. But the hallway was quiet. He rubbed his temples. Maybe it was all too late. Maybe she had already learned to keep her heart somewhere he couldn't reach. Then, again, maybe not. Over the last few days, Silas had noticed changes, subtle, like light shifting through curtains. Elodie had started lingering around the kitchen more. Her footsteps weren't as careful. She even left a crayon drawing on the counter once. That hadn't happened since the funeral. He knew what had changed. Amara. She moved through the house like she understood silence, not as something to be filled, but something to listen to. She didn't push Elodie to talk. She just stayed close. And for some reason, Elodie began to open like a window, unlatched. But with that light came shadows. Silas's assistant had forwarded a headline earlier that day. Wycliffe hires young housekeeper weeks after wife's passing. Sources say she's more than just staff. He clicked the article shut before reading past the headline, but it followed him anyway. That evening, drawn by the sound of unexpected laughter, he stepped toward the kitchen. The scent hit first, sugar, vanilla, a hint of burnt butter. Then the noise, light and uneven. Two voices chasing each other like wind through leaves. He stopped in the doorway. The kitchen was a beautiful mess. Bowls stacked beside measuring cups. A fine layer of flour dusted the counter and part of the floor. Elodie stood barefoot on a stool, grinning at Amara, who had a dab of batter on her cheek and didn't seem to mind. "Don't tell me we forgot the eggs again," Amara teased. Elodie giggled. "No, I cracked them perfect this time. No shells." "Progress," Amara said, smiling. "Chef in the making." For a few seconds, Silas just stood there, watching, remembering. His daughter's laugh had become a stranger to him, a ghost of someone he used to know. He cleared his throat, not loudly, but enough. Both heads turned toward him. "What's going on in here?" he asked, eyes shifting between them. Elodie didn't shrink the way she sometimes did. Instead, she lifted her chin, cheeks flush pink. "She's teaching me to bake," she said. "We're making cookies." Silas glanced at Amara. She wiped her hands on a towel and offered a small nod. "I'll have the mess cleaned up." He opened his mouth, closed it again, then nodded. "All right." And he turned and walked out. Back upstairs, he didn't return to his emails. He sat in the armchair by the window, watching dusk settle over the backyard. He should have felt relieved, grateful even. His daughter was laughing. She was smiling. She was coming back to life. But instead, he felt something hollow. Like joy had returned to the house, but had forgotten to invite him in. He rested his elbows on his knees, face in his hands. How did you compete with someone who had done in a few days what you couldn't do in months? He wasn't jealous. Not exactly. He was afraid. Afraid of being replaced in the one place where he was supposed to matter the most. Downstairs, the laughter returned, muffled by walls and floorboards, but still clear enough to reach him. The gilded cup wasn't fancy. It sat on the corner of Meeting Street with squeaky chairs, chipped tile floors, and windows that steamed up on cold mornings. But Amara liked it for one simple reason. It didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. She sat tucked into her usual spot by the window, a lukewarm mug of chamomile in front of her, and a small leather-bound notebook open in her lap. She wasn't writing much, just a sentence here and there, thoughts that slipped through the cracks when no one was looking. You're not part of their world. Be careful how far you reach. The last time you felt needed, it almost destroyed you. Amara stared at the words a little longer than she meant to. The truth of them sat heavy. Being around Elodie these past few days had felt natural, but too natural. The kind that sneaks up on you, soft and dangerous. The kind that makes you forget where the door is until you're already locked in. She sighed, closing the notebook and rubbing her thumb over the cover. She hadn't expected to feel anything here. She came to work to earn a paycheck, to keep her head down. But Elodie had that quiet kind of pull. The girl didn't just open up. She invited Amara into spaces that had been empty for too long. And that scared her. Back at Helix Care Technologies, Silas wasn't faring much better. His Monday morning had started with 3 back-to-back meetings and ended with a closed-door conversation with board member number 2, Martin Darnell. Martin, with his pressed collar and permanent squint, leaned across the table like they were swapping secrets. "Look," he said, lowering his voice unnecessarily. "I'm not saying you've done anything wrong. But people talk, Silas. Headlines like the ones last week, they stick. You've got a company tied to healthcare and families. Optics matter." Silas pressed his palms together, thumb tapping silently. "Amara is my housekeeper. That's it." Martin shrugged. "That's not how it reads online. Just keep it clean. You're rebuilding your image. Don't give anyone more fuel." The words followed Silas back to the office. He didn't want to admit it, but they landed. Not because he believed them, but because deep down a part of him wondered if others would. Later that evening, Margot showed up. She arrived unannounced, as she always did, in heels that clacked sharply against the marble foyer. "I heard from Martin," she said as soon as Silas opened the door. "You're making the gossip columns now." He gave her a look. "It's exaggerated." Margot walked past him without waiting for permission. She was dressed in charcoal gray, sharp-edged and immaculately pressed, like a woman permanently on her way to a courtroom. "Listen," she said, slipping off her gloves. "I'm not here to scold. But you need to think clearly. You're vulnerable right now, and that woman, Amara, she might be kind, but she's not family. You don't know her." "I know enough," Silas replied, voice clipped. "You knew Grace," Margot shot back, softening only slightly. "And you still lost her. Don't confuse comfort with stability." He didn't answer. Not because she was right, but because he couldn't argue from a place he wasn't sure of anymore. Upstairs, Elodie sat cross-legged on the carpet of her bedroom, colored pencils scattered around her. A sheet of thick paper lay in front of her, half finished. She was drawing her family. It was an assignment, not really. More of a private project Amara had encouraged during one of their quiet afternoons together. "Just a little exercise in expression," she'd said. Elodie had drawn herself first. Then her mother, soft smile, long hair. Then Amara, standing next to her, holding one of her hands. She added her father last. But she didn't place him beside her. Instead, she drew him at the edge of the page, turned slightly away, his hands tucked behind his back. It wasn't out of anger. It was just how she felt. Later, Amara walked in to help tidy up and paused when she saw the drawing. "This is beautiful," she whispered. Elodie looked up. "Do you think he'll be mad?" Amara paused. "Why would he?" "Because he's far away." Amara crouched next to her. "Sometimes people are close in real life, but still feel far. Doesn't mean they don't love you." Elodie nodded slowly, as if she wanted to believe it but wasn't sure she could. The next morning, Silas found the drawing on the kitchen table. Someone had left it there by accident, or maybe not. He looked at it for a long time. His chest tightened. He didn't touch the paper. He didn't ask who drew it. He just folded it in half, quietly, and slipped it into the drawer beneath the sink. Later, when Amara walked into the kitchen, she noticed the paper was gone. And when she looked at Silas, he didn't meet her eyes. But she felt it anyway. Silas had spent most of his life priding himself on control. He built Helix Care from a sketch on a napkin into a corporation that the medical world couldn't ignore. Investors trusted him, the press admired him, and even his competitors feared him. But none of that mattered in the quiet of his own home. Control slipped through his fingers every time he looked at his daughter and realized she was drifting farther from him. One late afternoon, Margot sat across from him in the Manor's library, her voice sharp but steady. The rain tapped lightly against the tall windows, and her tone matched the rhythm, pointed and persistent. "You're letting this get away from you," she said, crossing one leg over the other. "The papers are circling Silas. I've already seen the headlines. They're not subtle." Silas leaned back, rubbing his jaw. He had read them too. "I know what they're saying. I don't care about gossip." "You should," Margot replied. "Your company lives and dies on reputation. People don't buy stock in men who can't control their personal lives." He shook his head. "It's not about my personal life. It's about Elodie." Margot didn't soften. Then why does she smile for Amara and not for you? The words landed hard. Silas's gaze dropped to the glass of whiskey untouched at his elbow. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, rougher. If she trusts someone else more than she trusts me, maybe I was never enough to begin with. Margot's stern expression faltered for the briefest moment. She reached for her bag, preparing to leave. I know you're grieving, Silas. But grief doesn't excuse neglect. Think about it. When the door shut behind her, the silence in the library pressed down. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. His mind went back to that night, the night Grace's heart stopped beating. He had been on a flight, signing a contract, chasing the next big step for Helix Care. By the time he reached the hospital, she was gone. That failure lived in him like an infection, and no amount of success had ever burned it out. Now, when he looked at Elodie, he saw the same possibility. Losing her, not because she would die, but because she would learn she didn't need him. The next day, the weight of Margot's words seemed to spill into the world outside. At school, Elodie had been caught snapping at a classmate who mocked Amara. The teacher's note was curt. Elodie has been increasingly defiant, protective of household staff in ways that disrupt classroom order. And then came the tabloid. Billionaire Wycliffe's questionable bond with young housekeeper. The paper sat on his desk, garish black letters shouting what Martin and Margot had already warned. He thought about firing Amara. He thought about protecting Elodie from this circus the only way he knew how, by cutting out the problem. That night, thunder rolled across Charleston. The rain fell hard, beating against the manor's windows like fists demanding to be let in. Silas was on his way to bed when he heard it, the muffled sound of crying down the hall. He froze. Elodie's room. He stood in the doorway, watching his daughter thrash under her blanket, her small hands clawing at the air. No, Mama, don't go. The words cracked his chest open. He wanted to go in. He wanted to hold her, but his feet felt glued to the floor. He hadn't soothed her since she was a toddler. He didn't know how anymore. He hovered there, torn between love and paralysis. Then Amara appeared. Barefoot, hair damp from the rain she'd just come in from after closing up the kitchen. She didn't hesitate. She slipped into the room, sat on the bed, and gathered Elodie into her arms. It's okay, baby, she whispered, rocking gently. She began humming, then singing in a low, steady voice, an old lullaby, soft and familiar, as if she had sung it to someone long ago. Elodie's sobs quieted. Her breath slowed. Within minutes, she had curled against Amara's chest, eyelids fluttering shut again. Silas stood in the hall, his hand gripping the doorframe until his knuckles went white. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Watching them together was like watching someone else fulfill the role he had always promised himself he would hold. He saw it with painful clarity. Elodie needed Amara in a way she no longer reached for him. And as Amara smoothed the girl's hair and whispered a promise he couldn't hear, Silas felt the sting of tears slide down his face. He turned away from the doorway, chest heavy. In the shadows of that long hallway, he admitted the truth he had fought so hard to bury. The story had stopped being, there's the moment the press got a hold of it. It wasn't a family matter anymore. It was gossip. The kind you couldn't scrub off even if it wasn't true. Headlines sprouted up in Charleston like weeds in summer. Housekeeper or homewrecker. Inside, the Wycliffe Manor mystery. Young woman moves into billionaire's estate. Is it about the daughter or something more? Amara didn't have to buy the papers. She heard the whispers when she walked through the market, felt the eyes when she held the door for someone in town. Folks didn't say her name, but they didn't have to. She knew what they thought. At St. Aurelia Academy, the noise was sharper. Other parents whispered on the benches during pickup, their voices cutting just enough to be heard. It's not healthy, a child latching on like that. She barely talks to anyone else. Just that woman. Elodie noticed. Children always do. She stopped bringing drawings to class. She sat alone at lunch, chewing in silence while the laughter of other girls rang in her ears. She didn't cry, not in public. But at home, she clung to Amara's sleeve a little tighter. It was late one afternoon when Margot Hale arrived at the manor. She didn't bother calling first. Her car pulled into the drive with a sharp turn, heels echoing across the marble as she entered. She carried her authority like a weapon, and she aimed it squarely at Amara. "You need to think about what you're doing," Margot said, her voice as precise as her tailored suit. "This isn't about you. This is about protecting a family name that's older than you can imagine. Whatever comfort you think you're giving my niece, it won't last. And in the meantime, you're feeding a scandal that could ruin my brother." Amara stood in the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She kept her eyes level, her tone even. "With respect, I'm not here for your family name. I'm here because your niece needs someone who listens." Margot tilted her head, unimpressed. "Children adjust. She'll be fine. What she won't recover from is another headline dragging her father through the mud. If you care at all, you'll step away." For a moment, Amara said nothing. She felt the sting of those words like salt in a wound she thought had closed. Step away. She had stepped away before. From a husband who left her broken. From a home she couldn't stay in. Now here was someone telling her again that she didn't belong, that she was only temporary. Her throat tightened, but she swallowed it down. "I'm not taking anything that isn't mine," she said quietly. Behind them, Silas had walked in. He heard every word. Yet he didn't speak. He leaned against the doorframe, face unreadable, arms crossed like a man waiting for the storm to pass. His silence was louder than Margot's words. Amara felt it. She had hoped, maybe foolishly, that he would defend her. Instead, he said nothing. That silence was heavier than any insult. When Margot left, Amara stood by the counter, staring at her own hands. The question pulsed inside her. Am I really taking something I shouldn't? What she didn't know was that Elodie had been listening from the top of the stairs. The child's small fingers gripped the railing as her aunt's words drifted up the hall. She heard Margot's tone, saw Amara's face, noticed her father's silence. That night, in the corner of her bedroom, Elodie pulled out a notebook with a pink cover and clumsy lock. She pressed the pencil hard against the page and wrote, "If she leaves, I'll go too." She closed the book and hid it beneath her pillow, heart pounding. The house was quiet, but the air felt different. Even Amara noticed it. She excused herself early, saying she had errands, and walked down to the Gilded Cup. The little cafe was half empty, the smell of cinnamon rolls lingering though the oven had gone cold. She sat at her corner table, pulled out her own journal, and let the words spill. "I promised myself no one would ever hold that kind of power over me again. I promised I would never let anyone decide my worth, never hand them the keys to my heart. But this girl, this small, grieving girl, is breaking that promise without even trying." Her pen slowed, and she stared out the fogged window into the street. Rain tapped lightly against the glass. She thought of Elodie's laughter, of the way the child's hand curled around hers like it belonged there. The story broke just after sunrise, when most of Charleston was still wiping the sleep from its eyes. Amara had just finished folding laundry in the back hall when she heard the distant buzz of Silas's phone going off again and again, vibrating across the marble counter like it was alive. By noon, the headline had already made its rounds through the city. Housekeeper and the hidden life inside Wycliffe Manor. The article wasn't subtle. It painted Amara as a shadowy figure who had slipped into the household of a grieving billionaire. It questioned her past, hinted at motives, and suggested she had somehow inserted herself into a family that didn't belong to her. The kind of words that made readers lean in, not because they believed it, but because it fed their curiosity. At Helix Care Technologies, the fallout was immediate. Silas walked into the boardroom to find a row of stern faces waiting. Men and women who had known him for years, who owed part of their fortune to his ideas, now looked at him like a liability. "Silas," one of them said, "you know how fragile our partnerships are right now. We can't afford distraction." Another leaned forward, clasping his hands. "This situation, this woman, she has to be handled." The public reads a headline like this, and they don't think about innovation or medical breakthroughs. They think scandal. Protecting the brand means making hard decisions. We expect you to resolve it. Resolve it. Such a neat, clean word for what they were really saying. Let her go. That night, the dining room felt heavier than usual. The chandelier above glowed, but it didn't soften the mood. The silverware clinked faintly, echoing in a silence none of them wanted to name. Amara sat across from Elodie, trying to focus on her plate though her appetite had left hours earlier. Silas barely touched his food. His jaw tightened, as if every bite might choke him. Finally, he cleared his throat, eyes fixed on the linen tablecloth instead of either of them. Maybe, his voice was low, uneasy. Maybe it would be better if you stepped away for a while, until things settle. The words dropped like stones into still water. Elodie froze. For a second, she didn't move, her fork hovering mid-air. Then she pushed back from the table, so hard the chair screeched across the floor. "No," she shouted, her voice breaking. "If she goes, I'm going too." The sound of her outburst rattled the room. She had never spoken to her father like that, never raised her voice in this house of hushed tones and polite words. Silas blinked, stunned. Elodie. But she was already standing, tears welling in her eyes, chest rising and falling fast. "You don't understand. You never understand." She's the only one who, her words tangled in sobs, but the message was clear. Silas reached out a hand, but she spun away, bolting from the room. The echo of her footsteps climbed the staircase, and then vanished behind the slam of her door. Silence again. Only this time it was unbearable. Amara sat very still, her hands pressed flat against her thighs to stop them from shaking. She felt the sting of guilt pressing down on her chest. This is my fault. My presence is tearing this family in two. If I'd never stepped foot here, they wouldn't be bleeding like this. Yet beneath that guilt was something deeper, darker, a familiar ache that whispered, "You were never meant to stay. You are temporary, disposable." She stood slowly, gathering plates though she hadn't eaten a bite. Silas opened his mouth as if to say something, but nothing came out. The only sound was the quiet clatter of porcelain against porcelain. Later, when the kitchen was empty and the lights dim, Amara found herself alone at the counter. Her fingers brushed against the picture frame tucked near the bread box, the same one she had noticed her first day. Still turned face down. She picked it up, the glass cool beneath her touch. Her hand trembled as she hesitated, then traced the outline of the frame instead of turning it over. The image hidden inside felt like a door she wasn't allowed to open, a family she wasn't supposed to claim. Her breath caught in her throat. She set the frame back down, face still pressed to the counter, and whispered into the quiet, "I don't know how much more of this I can take." Upstairs, the house was silent again, but the fracture had already formed. A crack no one could ignore. Morning came thin and gray, the kind that didn't feel like morning at all. Amara knocked on Elodie's door with a soft rap, waited, then tried the knob. The bed was made. The little sweater Elodie always tossed at the end of the chair was gone. So were her sneakers. Amara's pulse kicked. She checked the bathroom, the sunroom, the window seat where the girl sometimes curled up with a book. Nothing. The house was too quiet, no cartoons drifting from a tablet, no humming. Just the low refrigerator buzz and the tick of a hallway clock that suddenly felt too loud. "Elodie," she called, moving faster now. "Honey." Downstairs, the back door was unlatched. A damp footprint, half a smudge, really, marked the slate just inside, angled toward the yard. Panic lifted in Amara's throat. She grabbed her phone and forced her voice to stay steady as she dialed Silas. "She's not in her room," Amara said, already slipping on her flats. "Back door's open. I'm going to look. Don't call the police yet. Not until we check the places she might go." Silas didn't argue. "I'll start driving," he said. The worry in his words needed no explanation. Amara headed to the driveway, wind tugging at her sweater. The air held that coastal damp as she slid into her car and tried to think like a frightened 9-year-old. Where would Elodie feel safe? Not school. Not the grocery store. Somewhere Amara felt safe. Haven Reach. The thought rose before she could talk herself out of it. Months ago, before Wycliffe Manor, Amara had spent Saturdays there sorting donated coats and reading to kids whose parents were working double shifts. Elodie had seen the blue lanyard with the Haven Reach logo hanging from Amara's key hook by the kitchen door. She'd asked about it once, eyes bright. "Do they have books?" Amara had smiled. Shelves and shelves. Traffic lights blurred as Amara crossed town. When she turned onto the block with the old brick gym that Haven Reach had repurposed, her hands were shaking hard enough to make the steering wheel thrum. The front steps were slick from last night's rain. The glass door was locked, but the side gate stood open, leading to the courtyard where volunteers sometimes sorted donations. She found Elodie there, small as a sparrow on the wooden bench, knees pulled up, chin tucked. The child looked up when the shadow fell across her shoes. "Amara." It came out a whisper, like she was afraid sound might break the spell of being found. Amara sat beside her, without touching, giving the girl space to decide. "You scared me," she said, breath unsteady. "I'm glad you're okay." Elodie's eyes were swollen. She scrubbed at them with the edge of her sleeve. "I don't want to go back if he's going to make you leave." The words landed like a stone dropped in deep water. No splash, just wait. Amara stared at the chalk drawings still faintly visible on the concrete, outlines of hopscotch squares and stick figure families. She swallowed. "He's trying to protect you," she said carefully. He panicked. Adults panic, too. Elodie shook her head hard. "At school, nobody likes me. They say things about you. They say you're not family. But you listen." Her voice trembled. "At school, I don't have anyone. Just you." A slow ache spread in Amara's chest. The sentence brushed up against her oldest fear. Being the only thing holding someone together, and then watching the floor drop out. She could feel the old instinct, the one that had kept her safe, telling her to step back before the ground gave way. She looked at Elodie's hands, small, ink, smudged, clenched so tight the knuckles went white. "Sweetheart," Amara said, choosing each word, "if I'm the only person you can stand near, then I'm not doing my job. My job is to help you stand near your dad, too." Elodie didn't answer. She leaned sideways instead, tipping until her shoulder found Amara's arm. The touch undid something in Amara that no lecture ever could. Footsteps crunched on wet gravel. Silas came into the courtyard, breath shallow, eyes scanning. Relief hit his face first, followed by something raw when he saw Elodie pressed close to Amara. "Elodie." He stopped a few feet away, as if afraid moving closer would send her running. "You're all right." His voice snagged on the last word. Elodie tightened her grip on Amara's sleeve, but she didn't hide. "I don't want her to go," she said, not looking at him. Silas nodded, like someone receiving a verdict. He turned his gaze to Amara, and for once there was no boardroom glaze, no practice calm. "I know what I said last night," he began, voice rough. It was clumsy. Scared. He glanced back at his daughter. "I lost my wife, Amara. I can't do that kind of loss again. And yet," he exhaled, emptying himself, "she keeps slipping away from me. No defense. No posture. Just a man standing in the open with his fear showing." The walk back to the car was quiet. On the drive, windshield wipers thumped a steady beat. Elodie toyed with the frayed edge of her sleeve, eyes on the rain. Amara kept her hands at 10 and 2, attention on the road, and the two lives sitting inside her orbit. At a red light, Silas spoke, not to argue, but to admit. "Maybe I've been trying to fix everything with the tools I know, money, control, statements that sound right. None of them hold a child." He glanced at the rearview mirror, at his daughter's reflection. "If you're willing to help me learn, I'll take the help." Back at the manor, Elodie slipped inside without looking behind her, hunger for familiar walls finally beating back her stubbornness. Silas lingered by the car, hands in his pockets like a teenage boy out of place. Amara studied him. Not the CEO, not the tabloid figure. A father afraid of being voted out of his child's life. She felt the ground of her certainty shift. Maybe staying didn't mean choosing sides. Maybe staying meant building a bridge sturdy enough for two people who had forgotten how to cross. The shift was gradual but relentless. Amara noticed it first in small moments. The way Elodie wouldn't start eating until Amara took the first bite. The way homework was only attempted if Amara sat right beside her. The way bedtime became impossible unless Amara lingered until sleep carried her off. At first it felt like tenderness, like proof that she had found a way past the walls the little girl had built. But with each day, the weight pressed harder. It was no longer closeness. It was dependence. Amara knew too well what that could mean. Children shouldn't be tethered so tightly to one person. What if she left? What if Silas decided her time was up? She could picture Elodie collapsing into a grief she might never recover from. The thought kept her awake long after the house had gone still. One evening, she decided to try a different path. After tucking Elodie in, she pulled the quilt up around her shoulders and spoke gently, as if nudging open a locked door. "Elodie," she said, brushing a curl off the girl's forehead, "you should talk to your dad more. He loves you. You can tell him things the way you tell me." The child stiffened, eyes wide in the dim light. "No. Why not?" "I don't need him," Elodie snapped, her voice sharp in a way Amara hadn't heard before. "I just need you." The room fell silent, so quiet that Amara could hear her own heartbeat. Neither of them realized that Silas stood just outside the door, his hand on the frame. He had come to wish his daughter good night, a rare effort to close the distance. What he heard instead struck like a blade. Inside, Amara tried to steady the moment. "That's not true, sweetheart. He's your father." "I don't care." Elodie's voice rose, hot with a desperation she didn't know how to name. "You're the only one who understands me. The only one who stays." Silas stepped into the room then, his face pale under the hallway light. His gaze darted between his daughter and Amara. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but the fracture beneath was unmistakable. "What have you done," he said slowly, "to make her turn against me?" The words cut deeper than if he had shouted. His eyes held both fury and fear, a storm Amara had no shield for. "I haven't," she began, but her voice faltered. She could see Elodie clinging tighter to her pillow, eyes red, shoulders trembling. In that instant, Amara felt the trap closing. No matter what she did, she was the axis around which their pain spun. Silas turned and left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Amara sat there a moment longer, smoothing Elodie's hair until the sobs subsided. But inside, she was unraveling. Later, when the house was dark again, she packed a small bag. The thought had been circling for days. Maybe her staying only made the fracture wider. Maybe leaving would force Elodie to lean back toward her father, where she belonged. Her chest ached with the thought, but she moved anyway, folding sweaters, sliding books into the bag with trembling hands. As she pulled open a desk drawer to check for stray pencils, something caught her eye. A piece of paper folded small, tucked behind a stack of notebooks. She opened it carefully. It was the drawing from weeks ago, the one Elodie had made for her school project. The colors were smudged now from being handled, but the image still struck like a secret confession. Elodie had drawn herself between Amara and her late mother, while Silas stood distant, almost faded. But this time Amara noticed something new. In the corner, added in shaky, uneven letters, Elodie had written, "If you leave, then I don't have a family." The words blurred as Amara's eyes filled. She sank down on the edge of the bed, the bag forgotten at her feet. The paper trembled in her hands, catching drops of her tears. She had promised herself years ago that she wouldn't let anyone hold power over her heart again, that she would never build roots where they could be ripped out. But Elodie's words, raw, simple, aching, stripped away that armor. Amara had always known this day might come. She just hadn't expected it to feel so heavy in her chest. The resignation letter sat folded inside her handbag, crisp and final, though the ink was smudged from where her hand had trembled as she signed it. She hadn't yet told Elodie. How could she? But the truth pressed against her ribs like a bruise. In her journal that night, she wrote slowly, as if weighing every word. "The longer I stay, the further she drifts from her father. I can't be the reason a family shatters. Leaving hurts, but staying might hurt worse." She closed the notebook, slipped it under her pillow, and sat in the quiet with her palms pressed to her eyes. Children, though, had a way of sensing storms before they broke. Elodie's glances lingered longer. Her questions carried a strange edge. "You're not going anywhere, are you?" Amara smiled and deflected, but her heart twisted. She knew Elodie could feel the shift, the way animals sense winter. The next morning, the newspaper arrived with a headline that scorched everything open: Billionaire Wycliffe and the housemaid who crossed the line. The photo beneath was grainy, taken through the gates, Amara walking beside Elodie, her hand steadying the girl's shoulder. What had been ordinary, even tender, was twisted into scandal. By noon, her phone buzzed with calls she didn't answer. Parents at St. Aurelia muttered in the hallways, their voices sharp as glass. Board members at Helix Care demanded immediate statements. She wasn't naive. She knew where the arrows were aimed. A housekeeper turned companion, a black woman in the halls of wealth. It was a story the world couldn't resist tearing apart. Margot Hale arrived at the manor the same afternoon, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a gavel striking wood. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Silas," she said in the study, her eyes steady, "this has gone too far. If you don't remove her, the Wycliffe name will drown in ridicule. The board won't stand for it. Neither will the shareholders." Amara stood silently near the doorway, the words pounding in her ears. Remove her. As if she were a stain, something to be scrubbed out before company arrived. Silas didn't answer immediately. He rubbed his forehead, weary, and for a moment Amara thought he might tell his sister to stop. But he didn't. His silence was worse than any agreement. That evening, the family gathered for dinner, though the air felt more like a battlefield than a table. Silverware clinked too loudly. Glasses rang when set down. Silas cleared his throat. "Elodie," he began, voice carefully measured, "you have to learn to rely on me. I'm your father, not someone else." His glance flicked toward Amara before dropping back to his plate. The words sliced the room open. Elodie's fork clattered against her plate. She stared at him, fury sparking in her eyes. "You," she cried. "You're never there for me. You don't even try." She's the only one who listens, the only one who cares. "Elodie." "No," the girl shouted, tears running hot down her cheeks. "I don't need you, I need her." She pushed back from the table, so hard the chair skidded against the hardwood, then bolted down the hall. Her sobs echoed through the house until a door slammed upstairs. Silas sat frozen, the weight of her words pressing him into stillness. His lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came. Across from him, Amara's hands trembled. She pressed them to her lap, fighting back tears. She had never wanted this, never wanted to be the wedge between father and daughter. Yet here she was, the center of their war, the shadow that stretched across both of their lives. Her eyes stung as she whispered to herself, too soft for him to hear, "This isn't what I'm meant to become." The house, usually so vast and distant, felt unbearably small. And Amara wondered if walking away might not just be a choice. It might be the only way to stop the breaking. The house felt too quiet when Amara realized Elodie wasn't there. Her backpack was missing from the hallway bench. The little sneakers she always left kicked off near the stairs were gone. Panic clawed at her chest before she could even form words. "She's not here," Amara whispered, her voice breaking. The staff searched the grounds. Silas barked into his phone, and within the hour police cruisers lined the driveway, their lights strobing red and blue against the rain-slick stone of Wycliffe Manor. Reporters seemed to appear out of nowhere, cameras pointed toward the gates, their voices filling the night with questions. Did the billionaire's daughter run away? Was the housemaid involved? The narrative was already being spun, and Amara could feel the weight of it pressing against her ribs. The idea that she might somehow be blamed was almost unbearable, but the greater terror was the thought of Elodie out there, alone, frightened. The rain came down in sheets, cold and relentless, soaking her clothes as she ran through the streets near Haven Reach. That place had been her refuge once, a shelter from storms she didn't have words for. If Elodie had gone anywhere, maybe it was there. Her breath caught when she saw a small figure hunched beneath the skeletal branches of a park tree near the center. Elodie's hair clung to her face, her hands gripping a piece of cardboard, edges already warping from the rain. "Please stay," the sign read in shaky letters. Amara dropped to her knees, mud splashing her jeans, and gathered the girl into her arms. Elodie was trembling, her lips pale, her voice no louder than a whisper. "I don't want to go back if you're leaving." Tears blurred Amara's sight. She rocked the child gently, unsure whether she was comforting Elodie or herself. The sign felt like a message written not just for her, but for the entire fragile bond they had built together. "Sweetheart, you can't stay out here. You scared us half to death." Before she could say more, footsteps pounded behind her. Silas, breathless, rain plastering his shirt to his frame, stumbled toward them. He stopped short, as though the sight of his daughter in another's arms pulled the air from his lungs. "Elodie," he choked, falling to his knees in the mud. His hand trembled as he reached for her. "Baby, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to hold on to you. I don't know how to do this right. But I swear, I'll learn. I'll try every day if you just, please, don't shut me out." The little girl turned, eyes red and wet, and she didn't resist. She wrapped her arms around him, clinging as though she feared he'd vanish. Amara was still there, her arm around Elodie's shoulders, and somehow all three of them were bound together in the storm. The world around them seemed to disappear, the flashing lights at the street corner, the distant rumble of thunder, the buzz of reporters who hadn't yet found this hidden corner. What remained was raw and simple. A father admitting failure, a daughter demanding love, and a woman caught between them, aching for a place that felt like home. Amara's mind spun. If she left, maybe the rumors would die down. Maybe Silas could reclaim his reputation, and Elodie would be forced to turn toward her father instead of clinging to her. It would be the practical choice, the selfless one. But as Elodie's small hand clutched at her sleeve with desperate strength, Amara felt the lie in that thought. Silas lifted his gaze to her then, his eyes stripped of the distance and pride she had come to expect. They weren't the eyes of a billionaire or a man trapped by image. They were the eyes of a father terrified of losing everything that mattered. "Don't go," he said quietly, voice breaking in the rain. "It's not just Elodie who needs you. I do too." For a moment, Amara couldn't breathe. Her heart pounded, every instinct pulling in opposite directions. But as the three of them knelt there, soaked to the skin, clinging to one another beneath the storm, she realized the truth. None of them wanted to face another loss. Not now, not ever again. The cardboard sign sagged in Elodie's grip, the ink bleeding into unreadable smudges. But the message was already etched in all of them. Please stay. The storm had passed, but the echoes of it lingered in every room of Wycliffe Manor. The rain-soaked night where all three of them clung to one another should have felt like a turning point. But for Amara, it was the beginning of a heavier weight pressing down on her shoulders. She returned to the manor with Elodie wrapped in a blanket, Silas silent beside them in the car. The hush of the house welcomed them like an old ghost, but Amara could not shake the gnawing question. Had she crossed a line she could never step back from? Later that week, Silas found her in the library. It was a room that always smelled faintly of leather and old wood, a room she rarely entered because of its weighty silence. He stood by the fireplace, not the commanding man she was used to, but someone unraveling. "When my wife died," he began, his voice rough, "I wasn't there. I was in another state, sitting in a boardroom, telling myself it was important for the company. I thought I had time, but I didn't." His eyes dropped to the rug, as though he couldn't bear to look at her. "I've been terrified ever since that I'd lose Elodie for the same reason. That work, my image, would take her from me too." Amara folded her hands in her lap, her throat tight. He wasn't confessing to her as an employer or a man of wealth, but as a father who was still bleeding from an old wound. She realized then that his fear wasn't about her. It was about repeating history, about failing again in the most irreversible way. She wanted to speak, to tell him that his daughter didn't need perfection, only presence. But before she could, the crack of another battle broke through their fragile moment. At St. Aurelia Academy, Elodie's world was collapsing in a different way. One afternoon, Amara was called to the school. She found Elodie sitting in the principal's office, her face flushed, a bandage on her cheek. She struck another student, the principal explained tightly. We cannot condone fighting, no matter the reason. The reason, however, spilled out in jagged sobs when Elodie finally spoke. They said my dad just buys love. They said you're not family, just the maid he pays to pretend. I couldn't stand it. Amara's chest ached as if someone had driven a nail through it. She smoothed the child's hair, whispering what comfort she could. But she knew words would never shield Elodie from the cruelty of others. By the time they returned home, the newspapers had already carried fresh headlines. Margot Hale had gone from whispers to direct assault. She had filed a petition in family court, demanding Silas prove that his daughter's environment was stable and fit. In her eyes, Amara's presence was evidence of chaos, scandal, and impropriety. The paper was delivered in a sealed envelope, heavy with consequence. Amara read the first line, and her knees weakened. She was named in the filing, though not directly accused of wrongdoing. Her existence in the household was listed as part of the destabilizing influence. That night, she sat in her room, staring at the two objects in her hands. In the right, a half-packed suitcase, clothes folded neatly, the faint smell of lavender, soap clinging to the fabric. In the left, the folded court summons, her name printed coldly in black ink. Her mind spiraled with choices she wasn't ready to make. If she left, perhaps Silas could stand straighter in court, prove to the world that his family was orderly and untarnished. Maybe Elodie would be spared the taunts, the stares, the rumors. Maybe the storm of judgment would quiet down. But if she left, what would that do to Elodie? The child who clung to her like a lifeline, who had begged her to stay in a rain-soaked park. The girl who had written in trembling letters that if Amara left, she would have no family left at all. The silence of the manor pressed around her, louder than thunder. She set the suitcase on the floor, her palm still gripping the court order. Her reflection in the darkened window looked like a stranger caught between two worlds, one that demanded she disappear and one that whispered she belonged. Her heart pounded with the question that refused to let her go. Would she choose to run or finally stay and fight? The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of smell that made everything feel heavier, more permanent. Amara sat at the long table beside Silas, her palms damp against the cool surface. Across the aisle, Margot Hale looked composed, almost triumphant, her lawyer stacking documents like weapons ready for battle. The judge entered, and the low murmur of the room quieted instantly. It was only a preliminary hearing, but the atmosphere carried the weight of finality. Amara's heart beat, so loud she wondered if everyone could hear it. Margot's lawyer began with a voice smooth as glass. Your Honor, this is not about wealth or privilege. This is about stability. A child deserves a home free of confusion, free of undue influence. What we have here is a live-in domestic employee who has, by all accounts, blurred boundaries with the minor in question. She is not family. She has no legal claim. And yet, she has inserted herself so deeply into the child's emotional life that it is now damaging the relationship between father and daughter. Every word felt like a stone thrown directly at Amara. She lowered her eyes, her throat tightening. Then Margot stood, her posture flawless. Your Honor, I have nothing against this young woman personally. But the facts are plain. She has overstepped. Children are impressionable, and Elodie Wycliffe needs her father, not a substitute. The presence of this housekeeper has turned the child against her own parent. The word housekeeper stung like a slap. Amara tried to steady her breath, but shame pressed against her chest. The judge glanced at Silas. Mr. Wycliffe, you've heard the concerns. Do you wish to respond? For a moment, Silas was silent. Amara could feel the heat of his indecision, the unbearable pause. If he distanced himself from her, if he said nothing, the court might view him as a more suitable guardian. He could protect his image, shield his fortune, and secure his rights. Her fingers curled tightly into her lap. She wanted to whisper, "It's all right. Say what you must. I'll go." But she couldn't find her voice. Silas rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. His expression was somber, but his eyes held a clarity Amara had not seen before. "With respect, Your Honor," he began, his tone steady, "what threatens my family is not Amara. What threatens my family is me." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Even Margot's carefully arranged expression faltered. Silas continued, his voice gathering weight. "For years, I believed providing meant protecting. I built walls of money and business around my daughter, thinking she'd be safe inside them. But those walls were cold. They kept her from losing anything, but they also kept her from living. Amara did not endanger my child. She reminded her what warmth feels like." He paused, his jaw tightening as though the words cost him. "If I must prove to this court that I am fit to raise Elodie, I will do so not by cutting out the one person who's shown my daughter joy, but by changing myself. By showing up as a father, not just a provider." The room was hushed, the kind of hush that carries both disbelief and awe. Even the judge leaned back slightly, as if trying to absorb the weight of his declaration. Margot's lawyer shuffled papers, clearly unsettled. Then, from the bench where she had been sitting quietly, Elodie's small voice broke through the silence. "If you make her go, then take me too." Heads turned. The little girl's cheeks were streaked with tears, her hands balled into fists. She looked at the judge with a trembling courage that made the room freeze. "Because the first time I heard laughter in my house again, it was because of her. She's not just someone who works there. She's the only reason home feels like home." The words cracked something wide open. There was no cross-examination, no polished rebuttal that could erase them. Even the court stenographer's hand slowed, as if moved by the weight of a child's truth. Amara's eyes blurred. She wanted to reach for Elodie, to hold her, but all she could do was sit there, her heart breaking and mending at the same time. The judge cleared his throat, visibly moved. "The court will take time to deliberate. No final decision will be made today." His gavel tapped lightly, more like a sigh than a command. As the room began to stir with whispers and footsteps, Amara stayed still. One truth had crystallized in the silence left behind. She was no longer just the maid who cooked meals and tidied rooms. Whether she admitted it or not, she had become the pulse that kept this family alive. The days after the hearing carried a strange weight. The house seemed quieter, though it wasn't silence. It was the kind of hush that came when everyone was waiting for the next blow to land. Amara moved through the halls with that sense of pause, as if the air itself was bracing. She knew Margot Hale wasn't finished. A woman like that never stopped until she got what she wanted. And she was right. 2 mornings later, a letter arrived, stamped with the crest of St. Aurelia Academy. Silas tore it open at the dining table, his jaw tightening as he read. "Effective immediately, pending further review, Ms. Amara Thomas is not permitted on school grounds in relation to Elodie Wycliffe," he read aloud, his voice flat but his knuckles white around the page. Amara felt her stomach twist. Elodie, who sat across from them, dropped her spoon with a clatter. "What does that mean?" "It means," Silas said carefully, "they don't want Miss Amara involved at the academy right now." Elodie's face hardened in a way that looked too old for her years. "So they're taking her away from me even at school? That's not fair." She shoved her chair back and stormed upstairs, the slam of her door echoing through the house. The following days spiraled. Elodie refused to attend classes, pretending to be sick at first, then openly declaring she wouldn't go. When Silas tried to push, she snapped, "School doesn't matter if they treat her like she's nothing." Amara's heart ached watching Silas struggle. He wasn't used to being powerless, and every missed day of school was another reminder that money, authority, reputation, none of it could fix what was breaking inside his daughter. By the end of the week, Amara knew she couldn't keep letting Margot pull the strings from afar. Running wasn't going to protect Elodie. Avoiding the fight only left the girl stranded in the middle. So she made a choice. She asked Silas where his sister was staying, and when he hesitated, she told him plainly, "I'm going to talk to her." That afternoon, Amara found herself standing in front of a polished brownstone in the Upper East Side. The doorman gave her a wary look, but let her in when she asked for Mrs. Hale. Inside, everything smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, immaculate like Margot herself. Margot stood waiting in the sitting room, a glass of white wine in hand. She didn't bother hiding her smirk. "I wondered when you'd show up," she said. "Though, I admit, I expected you to bow out quietly. That would have been wiser." Amara forced herself to hold the woman's gaze. "I'm not here to argue about wisdom. I'm here because Elodie is suffering, and we both know why." Margot's smile thinned. "You think too highly of your influence. That child needs discipline, not dependency on a housemaid who doesn't know her place." The words burned, but Amara stayed steady. "I'm not here to replace her father. I've never wanted that. But you," her voice wavered before she steadied it again, "you'd rather cut her off from the only bit of stability she's found than admit this family has cracks you can't patch with rules and money." Margot set down her glass sharply. "You dare lecture me about family? You, who couldn't even hold your own marriage together. You, who has no children of your own. You don't know what it means to keep a family intact." The hit landed deep, exactly where Amara feared it would. For a moment, her chest clenched with old shame. The divorce papers, the nights spent alone, the years of silence from the man she once promised forever to. Margot had dragged it into the light like a weapon. But this time, Amara didn't shrink. She took a breath and said quietly, "You're right. I lost my family, and I'll carry that pain as long as I live. But because I know what it feels like to lose everything, I will not stand by and let Elodie lose the only sense of family she has left." Her voice didn't rise, but it carried weight, a steady conviction Margot hadn't expected. Margot's expression faltered. Her eyes flicked, almost unconsciously, toward the doorway. Silas stood there. He had come unannounced, his presence filling the room without a word. He had heard everything. Amara's chest tightened, unsure what he thought, but when their eyes met, she saw it. The recognition. Not pity, not doubt, but a kind of respect. He saw that she wasn't just protecting Elodie. She was fighting in a way he himself hadn't managed. The silence stretched. Margot straightened her shoulders, but the cutting edge in her tone was softer when she finally spoke. "You're making a mistake, both of you." Then she picked up her glass again, turned slightly away, and dismissed them without another word. Amara left the brownstone with her pulse still racing, Silas walking quietly beside her. On the street, the noise of the city swelled around them, but neither spoke at first. Finally, Silas broke the silence. "You didn't back down." His voice carried something like wonder. Amara exhaled, her throat tight. "For once I couldn't. Not when it comes to her." He nodded, almost to himself. There was no need to say more. Back at the mansion, Elodie was waiting in the foyer, restless and worried. When Amara walked through the door, the girl's face lit with relief. "You came back," she whispered, as if she hadn't been sure. Amara knelt, smoothing a hand over Elodie's hair. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly. And she realized she wasn't just saying it for Elodie. She was saying it for herself. Upstairs in her room, Margot's silence lingered like a storm cloud that hadn't decided whether to break or pass. But in the quiet of Wycliffe Manor, something had shifted. Amara had claimed her place, not as a servant, but as someone who would fight for this fractured family in a way no one else dared to. The storm rolled over Charleston like a living thing, rattling windows, bending trees, and sending the news cycle into a frenzy. By dusk, headlines were splashed across every channel. Billionaire's daughter missing again amid family turmoil. Reporters camped outside the wrought iron gates of Wycliffe Manor, their umbrellas braced against the wind, cameras ready to catch any glimpse of tragedy or scandal. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was chaos cloaked in dread. Silas barked into his phone, demanding answers from private security, while staff hurried through the halls with pale faces. Amara sat frozen at the kitchen table, Elodie's letter trembling in her hand. "If she goes, I go too." The words cut sharper than any accusation Margot had ever thrown. Elodie's script was messy, smudged where raindrops had fallen onto the paper, evidence she had written it in haste, with tears. "She means it," Amara whispered, her throat tight. "She doesn't see a future here without me." Silas pressed a hand to his forehead, the storm outside matching the storm inside him. Where would she go? His voice cracked. For all his wealth and power, He was just a father terrified of losing his child. Amara shut her eyes, and an image flickered. The Haven Reach Community Center. It was the one place Elodie had smiled without hesitation, a place she had once called her safe corner. "I think I know," Amara said, already grabbing her coat. The streets were half-flooded, trees swaying violently, but Amara drove with single-minded determination. When she finally pulled up to Haven Reach, the building's lights glowed faintly against the gray curtain of rain. She rushed inside, calling out, "Elodie." Her voice echoed through the hallways until she found the girl curled in a corner of the activity room, clutching a damp blanket someone must have given her. Elodie's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but also defiance. "I'm not going back if you're leaving," she said before Amara could speak. Her voice was small but steady, as if she had rehearsed those words over and over. Amara's knees gave out, and she sank to the floor in front of her, the storm muffling into a dull roar against the walls. Her hands trembled as she reached for Elodie's. "Elodie, listen to me," Amara said softly. "I could go. I could walk away tomorrow. But if I do, you'll lose more than me. You'll lose a part of yourself that believes family can be chosen, not just forced." She swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "And I'll lose a part of myself too, because somewhere along the way, you stopped being just a child I looked after. You became you." Elodie's lip quivered, but she shook her head stubbornly. "If they make you go, then I'll leave too. I'm tired of people deciding for me." Amara's voice deepened, carrying the weight of her own scars. "Then let's decide together. Not you alone. Not me alone. Together. We choose each other, Elodie. But if we choose, we have to fight for it side by side." The room was silent except for the storm hammering the roof. Then footsteps echoed down the hall. Silas. He was drenched, his suit plastered to his skin, hair dripping into his eyes. He looked nothing like the untouchable man Charleston society admired. He looked like a father stripped bare, desperate and human. "Elodie." His voice cracked as he stepped into the room. He dropped to his knees beside her, his breath ragged. "I've failed you. I wasn't there when you needed me, and I've hidden behind excuses. I can't replace your mother. God knows I wish I could, but I can try to be the father you deserve." His voice shook as his eyes flicked to Amara. "And I can't do that without her." Elodie broke then. She threw herself into his arms, sobbing into his soaked shirt, clutching him as though she feared he'd vanish. Amara felt the tears spill down her own cheeks as she wrapped her arms around them both, the three of them tangled together in that small, rain-battered room. It didn't matter who was employer, who was employee, who belonged by blood. In that moment, they were only father, a daughter, and the woman who had given them back to each other. Elodie's cries softened into hiccups, her small hands holding on to both of them. "Don't make me choose," she whispered. "You won't have to," Silas murmured, kissing the top of her wet hair. His eyes met Amara's across the girl's shoulder, raw and unguarded. There was no pretense left. Only a plea, "Stay." They left Haven Reach together, stepping back into the storm as one. The drive back to the mansion was quiet, the rain drumming on the roof like a steady heartbeat. When they entered through the front doors, soaked and shivering, something strange happened. Elodie giggled, just a small burst of laughter at how ridiculous they looked, drenched to the bone, shoes squeaking on marble floors. It was such an ordinary sound, yet in Wycliffe Manor it felt revolutionary. Amara laughed too, and even Silas let out a low chuckle, his shoulders loosening. That night, the mansion, once a place of cold formality, echoed with a warmth it hadn't known in years, that not just since Amara arrived, but since tragedy had broken it apart. The house felt like a home. The storm outside raged on, but inside, three people sat close together, bound not by obligation or appearance, but by choice. Whatever battles lay ahead, whatever judgment the world would pass, they had made their decision. The morning after the storm felt different, as if the air itself carried less weight. For weeks, Amara had lived with her bags half-packed, convinced her leaving was only a matter of time. Yet when she woke that day, she didn't reach for the suitcase in the corner. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed and whispered to herself, almost testing the words aloud. "I'm not leaving." Her chest tightened, but not from fear. It was the strange ache of release. For so long, walking away had been her survival instinct. Back when she was married, staying had meant danger. Every bruise, every threat had taught her that retreat was the only form of protection. But this was different. Elodie wasn't a threat. Silas wasn't a prison. For the first time, staying meant courage. When she walked downstairs, she found Silas in the library, the morning light pouring in through tall windows. He looked tired, his tie undone, as though sleep hadn't visited him either. He turned when she entered. Searching her face for an answer he was afraid to ask. "I thought you'd be gone," he admitted quietly. Amara shook her head. "I used to think leaving was the only way to protect myself. But I've realized staying is harder. And maybe that's why it's the right choice." Silas didn't reply at first. His throat worked, as if he had to swallow the weight of her words. Then he simply nodded, the relief in his eyes saying more than anything else. Later that day, Margot came. The storm had passed, but she carried her own. She stood stiffly in the sitting room, her posture as sharp as her voice. Yet when she looked at Silas, then at Amara, something in her gaze faltered. "I watched the news last night," Margot began. "The way you both went after Elodie in that storm. I've called you reckless, irresponsible, even foolish. But maybe," her lips tightened before she exhaled, "maybe I've been the fool. I thought this house needed its reputation polished. What it needed was warmth." Silas leaned back, arms crossed, measuring her words with caution. But Amara saw the faintest tremor in Margot's voice, like a string finally giving way. "You're saying you were wrong?" Silas asked, not accusatory, just incredulous. Margot gave a small, weary smile. "I'm saying perhaps I cared more about appearances than about Elodie. And that was my mistake. It wasn't an apology, not fully. But it was something, an opening where before there had only been walls." 2 days later, Silas called for a press gathering outside the manor. Against his team's protests, he refused the polished speeches and rehearsed answers. He stood on the front steps with Amara at one side and Elodie at the other, the cameras flashing like a storm all their own. "My family has been the subject of 1,000 rumors these past weeks," Silas said, his voice steady but raw. "And I won't pretend they haven't hurt. But I need to say one thing clearly. Amara is not a scandal. She is not a liability. She is a part of this family. That is the truth, and it's the only truth that matters." Questions were shouted, microphones shoved forward, but Silas didn't linger. He guided Elodie and Amara back inside, leaving the words to hang in the air like a defiance no headline could twist. In the silence that followed, Margot stood at the far end of the hall, watching them. There was no outburst, no venom, just a quiet acknowledgement as her eyes rested on Elodie's hand gripping Amara's. When she finally turned to leave, she paused at the doorway, her expression unreadable, except for one faint softness that hadn't been there before. Amara watched her go, not triumphant, not relieved, just aware that for Margot, change would come slowly, if at all. But at least the battle had shifted. It was no longer about control, but about learning what love required. That evening, Elodie tiptoed into the kitchen carrying a picture frame. On the counter lay an old photograph of her parents, its glass cracked from years of being moved and hidden. She placed it upright again, but this time she added something new, a fresh photo she had begged one of the staff to print. It was of the 3 of them in the rain, soaked through, clinging to each other as if the world itself might try to pry them apart. Elodie smoothed the frame with her small hands, then looked up at Amara, her eyes shining. "It feels complete now," she said softly. Amara's throat tightened. She reached out and wrapped her arms around the girl, holding her close. And maybe ever, she felt not like an outsider standing in someone else's house, but like she belonged, right there in the picture, in the family, in the home they were finally making together. The house no longer felt like a museum. For months, Amara had tiptoed through Wycliffe Manor, as though each step might disturb the silence of its halls. Now, on that quiet morning, the silence was gone. The kitchen was alive. The sunlight came in pale and soft through the windows, spilling across the counters and the long oak table. The scent of batter and cinnamon drifted through the air, carried by the low hum of the waffle iron. Elodie perched on a stool, hair pulled into a lopsided braid she tried to do herself, while Silas stood at the stove clumsily flipping bacon. Amara moved between them with ease, filling glasses with juice, laughing when Silas burned one of the strips. "You're supposed to turn it, not fight it," she teased. He gave her a sheepish smile, shaking his head. "Finance I can manage. Breakfast still a work in progress." Elodie giggled, the sound light and unguarded. She reached for a piece of fruit and added, "You're better than last time, Daddy. At least the smoke alarm isn't screaming." The three of them laughed together, and the kitchen felt full in a way it hadn't since the day Amara first stepped inside. Then the air had been heavy with formality, with unspoken rules and the cold presence of wealth. Now there was only warmth. Amara set a plate down and paused, letting her eyes take it all in. The steam curling up from the waffles, the playful bickering between father and daughter, the sunlight touching the edges of everything. She thought back to the version of herself who arrived here, a woman still carrying bruises no one could see, afraid that staying anywhere too long might invite heartbreak. "I thought surviving meant leaving," she murmured, half to herself. Silas glanced over, hearing her tone. And now, she looked at him, then at Elodie, who was busy layering too much whipped cream on her waffle. "Now I think surviving means choosing to stay. Choosing love, even when it terrifies you." Her words landed gently, but they carried weight. Silas didn't answer right away. He only nodded, and something in his face, some softening she had rarely seen, made Amara realize that his journey was no less profound than hers. He had been a man bound by fear of failing, fear of being absent again like the night his wife had died. But now he was trying. He was present, messy, imperfect, and human. And Elodie, the little girl who once barely spoke above a whisper, who had hidden behind walls taller than the manor itself, was laughing freely, her eyes bright. She had chosen to trust, to open her arms. That was no small miracle. The three of them sat together at the table, passing plates, sharing food. Bacon, waffles, orange juice. It could have been any American breakfast. But to Amara, it was holy. She glanced at the framed picture propped on the kitchen shelf, the one Elodie had placed there days ago. Three people, drenched in rain, clinging to each other with everything they had left. A family not by blood, not by duty, but by choice. Family isn't where you're born, Amara thought, her chest swelling. It's where you choose to stay. Her eyes stung, but she let the tears come. They weren't the tears of someone cornered by loss. They were the tears of someone who wasn't afraid of belonging. The meal wound down, but the laughter didn't. Elodie told a silly story from school. Silas countered with a disastrous tale from his college years, and Amara shook her head at both, unable to stop smiling. Then the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the kitchen, sharp against the softness of the morning. Elodie jumped up before anyone else could move. "I'll get it," she chirped, dashing out of the room. Silas and Amara exchanged a glance. Just a package, probably. Nothing unusual. But when Elodie returned, her steps had slowed. She held a single envelope in her hands. "It was just sitting there," she said, setting it gently on the counter. The paper was thick, the ink bold. On the front, in deliberate handwriting, were the words, "To Amara Ellison, from your past." Amara's breath caught. The room seemed to tighten around her, though sunlight still poured in, though the smell of waffles still lingered. She stared at the envelope, her hands refusing to reach for it. Behind her, she felt Silas's presence steady, and Elodie's curious eyes watching. For once, the past hadn't come for her when she was alone. The kitchen remained warm. The laughter still hung in the air. Whatever this envelope carried, whatever shadows it might drag forward, Amara knew she was no longer facing it with empty hands. The picture frame caught the light again. Three figures locked together in rain. A promise. The screen of imagination faded to black, leaving only the echo of a bell and the weight of an unopened letter. The journey of healing wasn't finished. But now, Amara had a home to return to, no matter what the past demanded. Sometimes family isn't the people we're born to, it's the ones who choose to stay, even when walking away might seem easier. Amara, Silas, and Elodie remind us that healing begins not in perfection, but in the courage to show up for each other, flaws and all. Maybe that's the real question we're left with. When life gives us the chance to leave, do we dare to stay? If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter of healing, love, and second chances.